But ultimately, this is also where you notice that what people say and what they do is quite different. They say, I support green, I support this, support that. So when someone rings them, someone says, okay, you know what, I'm all in, I'm gonna support you. I'm an oil guy, but you know what, I'm going all in on wind. But we need to do it in steps, because this is where we need to get to. And he lost a lot of money trying to support wind. Because they couldn't get it off the ground, they couldn't get agreement of people using the transitionary period of, instead of funding, instead of using coal for the power plants to use it as the fuel for the power plants using natural gas. So he ended up with a lot of very large turbines just sort of sitting around doing nothing. And the thing is, for example, with wind, it isn't as straightforward as you think. It isn't the more wind, the better. No, actually, if you have too much wind, the turbines can like damage and break apart. Of course, if you have no wind, it doesn't help you either, but you have too much and break apart. And as we saw from Texas recently, if it gets too cold, the turbines don't work either. So it's not a panacea. And of course, they don't like to admit they're not always very environmentally friendly, because they kill birds, they kill a lot of things, they take a lot of room. For example, let's assume this podium here is the size of a power plant. If you try to replace the generation capacity of this podium with wind or with solar, well, with solar it probably would take this whole backyard, not this amount. You know, because they like to see it when they show you, or they like to show 3 wind turbines are going to take care of this. No, the solar would probably be all of this or more. Wind, it would probably be turbines from here all the way to like maybe 7 blocks down the road. People don't seem to really put that into context. And interesting thing also about T. Boone Pickens, he said he was talking to, I think he was candidate Obama at the time, and he says, oh, my dream is I want to see 1 million electric cars on the road. He says, that's wonderful, I'll support you, but you do realize that we build about 14 million new cars every year, just in the United States. So $1 million cars, electric cars really is a drop in the bucket. It's not going to solve the problem. That's one thing. The second thing is you got to keep in mind is that those very same states, blue states for the most part, who don't want to invest in electricity generation capacity because of environmental reasons, if they're the ones who also want the electric cars, well, how are you going to actually charge these cars? You need to build the generating capacity, you need to build the transmission capacity, and that will require having to tear up the ground a bit and do several things. It does. Everything in life is a trade-off. It's not just, you know, puppies and flowers and everything's wonderful. No, everything in life is a trade-off, and they're hard trade-offs that you need to make, hard decisions. Yes?
It looks like you have everything to win.
Pardon me?
It looks like you have everything that you need to win. You have charisma, eloquent speech, knowledge, age, energy. My problem is I really need to know what you're going to do. And this is really very serious about the corruption. I know corruption is like, this is the way it is and we cannot do anything. But for example, I live in Brighton Beach and we have a lot of homeless people. And I understand that Mayor de Blasio's wife got $800 million to solve this problem, to get these people to get treatment, to get shelter and everything. Nothing happens and $800 million are gone.
$1.5 billion.
That's what it is right now?
Yeah.
It's our money. Now, I understand the controller is not the mayor. And there is even if you won the seat, there are going to be a lot of Democrats who will support, let's say, Adams who wins. I hope that Curtis is going to win, but let's say Adams. How are you going to navigate all these corridors just to fight the corruption and to stop at least this visible, this land corruption?
Well, you're absolutely right. And it's not going to be resolved overnight. It's going to take a lot of buying from a lot of people. That's why I highlighted that as controller I could work with any of the mayors. And that's also why I push forth the issue of the pension plan so much. Why is that? Not because we're all city employees, we're not. But I was one to ask, well, yeah, but you know, you have these good ideas, but the people in the government, they're the ones, not just the big elected officials, the bureaucracy, they're going to do what they're going to do. So how are you going to get them to change and be able to help you advance some of your agenda? And that's why I bring up the pension plans, because who does that really affect? The bureaucrats that are in there now, and the ones later, and the ones that hope in the next 10, 15 years to retire, and if they're perfectly fine with the status quo, great, but if you have to educate them and really, you know, kind of shake them out of there and say, that's fine, but you know that if you keep going the way you're going, that check may not be there for you. If you think about Social Security, where we're saying Social Security is going bankrupt, it may not be around for me, it may not be around for some of you. But the difference between the federal government and the city government, federal government can print money. They can do whatever they want. The money may not be worth anything, but they'll give you a check. If I promised you a $2,500 check for life a month, I can give it to you. That $2,500 may be worth 25% of what it's worth now when you get it, but I can promise it to you. The city government can't do that. So it's really going to be a battle of trying to get buy-in from those very bureaucrats that you're going to need, even more so than the elected officials, because they're the ones who are there forever.
I have my own.
But it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be overnight.
Well, yeah,
Do you want an umbrella? I'll hold
No,
it.
I'm fine for right now.
yeah, I have a question about,
Yes.
We often, the Tea Party came into existence because of fiscal responsibility. So, what was it, over 10 years ago. So, my question is, not often enough things raised even within the city. You guys talk about fiscal responsibility. What's the current deficit right now? No one's been bringing that up. Because we hear the higher earners are looking to leave rather. We already talked about that, and they have been for a long time. The guy that owned paychecks, he left many years ago.
Golden Sun.
Yeah, so there's a lot of people. He runs the government. There's a lot of people leaving the city as well as the state. I personally know people that are high earners that went to Texas, Arizona,
Of course.
as well as Florida. So somebody's going to have to deal with this. They can't keep kicking the can down the road. It's the big elephant, if you will, no pun intended, in the room. It's been there for a long time. So regardless of what happens next month, it's gonna be like the bad old early '70s. I don't really remember it too well, but I remember watching Serpico.
Well, at least remember the 80s. That was
But I remember watching Serpico and seeing how the city was back then. It's a very good movie, by the way. So what do we do? Because I know people that are already in the game, being law enforcement, teachers, other first responders. What's going to be with that?
I remember, in fact, I used to live, I don't know how familiar you are with East New York.
Yeah.
It's a pretty rough neighborhood. I used to live there pre-Giuliani days. And when I got out of college, I had family there. That's where I first moved to. So I've seen it. And I know a lot of the people have seen how things have been deteriorating. But, go here. You know, they call it the problem, what they call the law of large numbers. When you tell somebody, we have a deficit of 9 billion, we have a deficit of 10 billion. The problem is that for most people that number doesn't seem nearly.
I'm good.
No, this is fine. If you can see me all right?
Yes.
So for example, if you have your checking account, it says, oh my God, I'm overdrawn by $1,000. That's terrible. That means something to you. That makes sense to you. You say, oh, we have, we're underfunded by $120 billion. Oh, that's a lot. Well, what does that mean? So that's why I think we need to educate and put things into context, and that's why I say, well, you saw the Freedom Tower? You could build it 35 times over for that amount of money. You see our city budget? It's doubled, despite the fact that we've almost haven't grown the population, and in fact, since the pandemic, people are moving out.
Another follow-up question, by the way.
Yes.
We keep hearing rumors about Wall Street saying, oh, we can really relocate any time.
They're good.
Is that something they're just putting out there, or is that...
I'm sure it's a little bit of both. It's for one thing, it's definitely a negotiating tactic.
Yeah.
I mean, after 9/11, many of them, or at least put a lot of their back office operations to Jersey City, Tennessee. I mean, like I said, I lived in Georgia many years. And back then, back in the 80s, it was a lot of Midwestern manufacturing corporations, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, coming down to the South. And everyone says it's great, the weather's great, taxes are lower, the suburbs are beautiful, nice quality of life. They definitely could go, especially, I remember reading stories, all the working virtually. I remember reading this particular article. This investment banker from Goldman Sachs, who was living in Scottsdale, Arizona, and still getting paid his New York salary, doing deals, doing everything remotely. He wasn't there just temporarily. He had no intention of coming back to New York City. And then a lot of them who are being asked, okay, now you have to come back, they would much rather say, no, I don't think so. And that's happening. Part of the reason we see a shortage of workers in many areas is because some people say it's the benefits. At this point, the benefits has less of an impact because most of that has run out, and that's more on entry-level positions. But on other areas, they're saying, you know what, I could get another job working fully remote and making more money. Why am I going to go to the office every day? Or, guess what, I seem to enjoy spending time in Pennsylvania, or down in Virginia, or down in Texas, or in Georgia, or in Florida. And then if I'm in, for example, in Texas, Florida, or Tennessee, I don't have to pay taxes. I lived in Texas for a year, and let me tell you, not paying taxes was a really wonderful thing. Let me tell you, when I moved back to New York City, and I got a refund for all the state taxes New York City would have charged me, it was something like $13,000. I was like, oh my Lord. And it's hard to fathom. So the people who have the means are moving away. And the people in the city, they have to be shaken into, away from that slumber that they're in, and say, hey, this is the way we're going. For one of the arguments were saying, hey, the city's coming back. I'm a New Yorker. When Jerry Seinfeld wrote that article rebutting James Altucher, because James Altucher wrote this article, he's this finance guy who has a blog or whatever and a podcast, and he said, oh, New York is dead. It's not the way it used to be because of the pandemic, and it's probably not going to recover the way it was for a couple of decades, which I'm hoping not. Jerry Seinfeld said, oh, you're a putz, whatever. No, New York is here to go. But then if you have to look at it very...
Jerry's in his ivory tower.
Yeah, dispassionately, and actually have to live with the consequence of those actions. Because if you're off in the Hamptons or something, yeah, it's great to you. But you're not in New York City.
You can go between the Hamptons and Manhattan whenever you want.
Exactly, and the thing was, sure, the city can turn around. Well, the question is, will it turn around the next couple of years, the next couple of decades? Now, the next couple of decades, I'll be retired, hopefully. I don't want to have to wait till then. I don't want to have to go through the bad old 70s and 80s all over again, or even the early 90s, to get to a place where we were at ease and fine and you could walk down the street with no problems. It's not the same thing now. You go down in the subway, I'm seeing things I haven't seen in 25, 30 years. And this whole thing of, unfortunately, a lot of people with mental illness or people who are drug addicted, they jump on people and do things, but they're not even in the right mind of knowing what they're doing. Do you think I want my 14-year-old daughter riding the subway alone now like she did a couple of years ago?
Well, and there, it's not only the politicians that are oppressed. There are these bogus programs in Brooklyn, like all of a sudden people, drug programs. Why are people on drugs? I tell my kids, try, don't take drugs, try. But there's so many of these people, these non-profit organizations are also ripping off, the New York City, and there were these programs. Oh, we're going to set up why is your community on drugs? I mean, it doesn't help. Why are we falling into this drugs?
When I was
or any program. Oh, this community is. We need this and this. This is all bogus. This is a waste of money.
Many years ago, I was involved, particularly when I was even more active in politics back then. But I was involved in a lot of these Latino or Hispanic community organizations, primarily business. So I was executive vice president of Manhattan Republican Chamber of the Manhattan Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and a Brooklyn, and also the Brooklyn Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. So, and I'm going to say this, and within us, we kind of knew the truth about most of these nonprofits and these organizations. All they were there for was to basically go to city or some of these other big companies and get some of that CRA money to help fund. And usually the extent of their events and meetings were, okay, let's say we're going to do something at a restaurant. We're going to give an award to the owner of the restaurant, and we're basically going to have a nice shindig with nice food and drink, and we're going to talk about a lot of platitudes, and the struggle continues, and la comunidad latina, mi hermano, todo muy bien, all these things, but they did nothing. And in the quiet, on the down low, they would say, the way we referred to all of them were poverty pimps, because that's what they were.
Right.
They were basically taking a lot of money from a lot of things and doing actually very little for the community. There were a few who were quite good, or tried, they had their heart in the right place. But ultimately, you had a lot of presidents and vice presidents of nonprofit and community organizations, so they all had a title, they had a nice card, and they was, I'm this and I'm that and all these things. But they didn't do very much. And I remember
there's so much corruption. The real estate people, they build, they don't care about the communities, they just,
Got to look at the construction industry.
there's so much corruption.
You got a question right here?
Yes.
Questions?
I have a question. I'll preface it by saying I work with a lot of campaigns locally all the way to mayoral, and I have to say you're one of the most
Yes.
I appreciate that.
Yes, you are. Yes.
I have to be very honest. I hesitated a lot even jumping in this for all the other sort of party reasons, but I had been out of the game for a while. And that's probably what many of you haven't heard me, but if I told you my documentary, you'd probably maybe even remember me from back then, but I appreciate that.
That's no problem at all.
So, how do we find you, Paul Rodriguez?
Rodriguez, so it's
You have a car?
Paul Rodriguez, Comptroller, New York.
GUEZ, the number 4, NY.org.
We'll send it
And
out.
Rodriguez 4NY is also my Twitter and my Instagram.
We'll put
send
it on
out
Facebook.
in an email.
Oh, okay.
We'll post it
And
up,
also-
so you can see it also. I think we have a question
But yes, he
for
didn't finish.
Heshi and
He
then
didn't finish.
Alan.
Actually, I think
I
he's
think
still.
so.
Are you still in the question? I
Yeah,
apologize.
he didn't finish. Let him
Come back
go.
around. You can come back around.
Yeah, go
No, please, and then I'll go to him.
It is a little question, so if you can't answer, it's okay.
No, please.
But I wanted to say, okay, you're elected in office tomorrow. You seem to understand the role of comptroller extremely well. What's your first course of action?
First course of action, I think you need to hire the right people. Get my chief of staff, which would likely be the person who recruited me into this in the first place. You have to put around people you can trust. That's the first thing. The second, and a more operational thing, which is part of my platform, is I want to identify or train people in the system called Lean Six Sigma. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. Lean Six Sigma is a system of best practices for how to find inefficiencies in different types of operations and how to make an organization run better. It's something that was applied to the manufacturing sector initially, so that's something if you go on LinkedIn or other people that say, oh, I'm a black belt, Lean Six Sigma, or a green belt, it means that they've had a certain amount of training for a way of looking at the way certain operations run, certain processes are managed, and how you can find ways of making them run better and making them more relevant to the objectives you're trying to achieve. So I want to bring people with that type of expertise, if it's necessary externally, but also train people internally, because that's going to be the first step of being able to identify where are the areas where you can reduce some of the waste and manage things better. Because it is, and that is sort of the first step in terms, and it's very related to the pension funds, because only if we're able to basically make the agencies leaner, and then after that, things such as selling off real estate that the city probably shouldn't have, renegotiate leases, renegotiate contracts, but also trying to give preference to local contracts if they come within 5% of the lowest bid. Things of that nature really get buy-in from everybody into the city, where you can find savings to be able to say, okay, how can we best tackle these pension liabilities?